Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the session today where we're going to be talking about all things content. So my name is Alicia Gianfrido, and I'm a director in the digital transformation team at DT Consulting. I'm really excited to have here with me today Hannah Price, who's a senior director in our customer excellence practice at DT. So we're going to jump in and we're going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing at the moment across the content space. And importantly, we're working with lots of different clients right now, and many of them are asking me the same questions, which is, how do I actually achieve this ambition of content excellence, and how do we make this thing work in new and exciting ways? Realistically, this is all part of a much bigger mission. So all of my partners that I'm working with right now are trying to enable an omni-channel ambition or an aim. And content, of course, is part of that. The bigger aim is actually around personalization and how we get ourselves to a point where we understand and can create really exciting and compelling content that's going to be delivered to our customers in the right way at the right time. I'm watching right now where many content transformation programs are being established, and folks are tackling this in a variety of different ways. And so we're seeing some individuals who are doing bottom-up approaches. So maybe within an affiliate, we have a team that's looking specifically at data and tagging and how we're making the most out of understanding our key messages, for example. I have other individuals who we're working with at the moment who are looking much more holistically. So they're looking at the entire global to local model and trying to understand across the content lifecycle, really what's going well, where are our pain points, how are we actually achieving operational excellence such that we can be much more synchronized and coordinated in how we're actually planning, creating, producing, and publishing and optimizing content. And then there's others who are taking this from a purely experience point of view and looking at outcomes. So they're trying to make sure that quality is the key, and quality is king, really, in that any piece of content we're creating, that we understand whether or not it's fit for purpose for our customers, that it's the right message, that it's in the right format, in the right channel, to be able to meet the unique needs and preferences of all of our different customer types. So when we put it mildly, really, the ambition is to be able to deliver personalized experiences with content in the right channel. When you say it like that, it's a fairly straightforward goal. Of course, behind the scenes, this is quite a challenging proposition or aim. And we're seeing this come to life, these challenges across operational excellence buckets, but also in terms of how we're actually thinking about customer experience outcomes and how we're measuring these things.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm going to jump in on that point around customer experience outcomes. There's a key element that we've seen from our CX research in 2022, which we've done with healthcare professionals. We've asked them about very specific interactions they're having with pharma companies. We conducted this survey across 14 markets, including the US, Canada, and the European 5. And from that interaction perspective, irrespective of the channel or the content that HCPs are using when they're coming to having those conversations with pharma organizations, we look at very specific drivers. And year on year, from a CXQ perspective, which is the way that we measure customer experience at DT, we look at three key drivers: relevance, trust, and simplicity. However, this year, we also asked a question around personalization as an attribute of customer experience. And we saw that personalization scores were significantly lower than other attributes that we looked at. And although what content is just one part of the experience that an HCP has with a pharma organization, I think in the discussion that we're having today and what we want to talk about, we can really think about content as being a key component in terms of how HCPs perceive the personalization of an experience that they're having with pharma companies. So what does this mean when we look at different channel perspectives of this? So again, from the report that we did this year, we looked at what we were seeing from a question that we asked HCPs around what channels they prefer when it comes to interacting with pharma organizations. And then we also assessed how those channels were performing when it came to the overall experience. We can see that channels where a pharma person, so either sales rep or a medical liaison or a medical rep, has the ability to be able to customize or target content, these channels were not only the preferred channels, but also had some of the highest preference and experience scores. A channel that includes a person from a pharma organization enables them to be able to answer very specific questions or requests that are coming through from an HCP with both a tailored agenda and also personalized content. I mean, obviously, content is not the only element driving this experience, but I do think it's a very key part. And it also enables us to be able to say that within inside these experiences, when we can have that focus and that targeted element driven by the rep, we can see that that is really resonating then from an HCP in terms of what they see in terms of value and how they want to engage. There are other elements that obviously having a person involved does help support with, such as the ability to be able to obtain information easily, especially now, HCPs wanting to be able to contact their reps via SMS messages. That is a very easy way to be able to get content, or the ability to trust content. If you've been having a relationship with that person with a pharma organization for 10, 15 years, you're much more likely to come to that engagement believing the information that you're provided with. However, as we're now starting to focus much more on an omni-channel engagement model and start thinking about how content can help us with inside this broader digital setting that we're now seeing, we're not seeing those investments in content translating at the moment to a level playing field when it comes to this cross-channel experience that's being provided. And I wanted to dive a little bit into why we think that might be happening from a content perspective. Another question we asked with inside the survey was really focusing in on what types of content do you want to receive from pharma organizations. And if we look at the blended mix on the screen now, we can see that there is elements that are still very much driven from the commercial part of the organization, but there are also elements that would be coming through from either medical affairs or even clinical trials to a certain extent in terms of where we need to be getting that content from. If we think about the experience that an HCP can have with a person from a pharma organization, they can make sure that content is curated for them. However, if we're looking at digital channels, specifically self-serve digital channels, such as websites, these require HCPs to browse and search for the information themselves, as opposed to having it just handed to them. So this experience becomes a lot more driven by how the content and the channel teams are working together with inside that content model to be able to deliver this information. And from the work that we've done, we've seen that most of these channels are still very siloed. Either the HCP is only being provided with specific disease or prescription information, or in some cases where we are seeing that clinical or real-world evidence being provided, that's still very much siloed and not brought together in one holistic area where an HCP can find it. This is a bigger challenge that we see, especially as pharma organizations are going through the process of consolidating their digital landscape together, bringing a lot of different brand and content together onto these centralized portals. So we now need to make sure more than ever before in these centralized portal worlds that the information that HCPs want to access from across the business is curated and presented to them in the best way to be able to meet their goals. And I was wondering from your perspective, why you think that isn't happening at the moment?
So, what we're seeing right now is that we understand where we want to go. We know what our preferences look like in most instances. And so the question becomes, how do we actually put our operating building blocks in place to be able to achieve that outcome? And so at DT Consulting, we do research into content excellence, where some of the early results are telling us some really compelling stories about how the global to local model is actually working in practice. And when we split our global, regional, and affiliate points out, what we see is the start of a very interesting story. So, of course, one of the most critical points of how we realize efficiencies around content is actually having a really synchronized and well-coordinated global to local model. And that's everything from the point of planning all the way through to publication and how we're thinking about optimization. When we see the results here, the first thing to point out is that content planning tends to be one of our lower maturity pillars relative to the others. This is not necessarily surprising. So many of our partners in the life science industries are on journeys at the moment to transform how they're thinking about planning, going from brand-centric planning to customer-centric planning. And content, of course, is at the core of that. What's more is that when we look explicitly at the differences in maturity between our global and our affiliate teams, we see that global actually tends to be self-reporting, at the very least, a bit lower in terms of that content excellence maturity. So this tells us a few things. First, it's that our affiliates are probably still picking up things in market and running with things so that they can build their own capability to meet very specific needs and goals around content for customers. But it also tells us that perhaps there's some effort that we can put into to understand how we actually enable better co-creation between our global and our affiliate teams, for ensuring that when we get content to the point that it's in front of the affiliate, it has what we would term utility. So that means that it's fit for purpose, it's something that meets their needs, it's aligned to messages, they can pick it up and they can adapt it quite easily. And part of that journey is going to be thinking about capability. And that maturity model that we're looking at here tells us that we need to build some maturity within some of those global teams, that are now going to be tasked with thinking about things like modular and how we actually achieve new ways of developing and putting content together. What's more is that when we break this data apart and we look across role types, we start to see what I would say is probably the crux of the challenge here, which speaks to the point that Hannah was making around having new preferences and wants from our customers around medical information and things that come from our medical colleagues. If we look at the slide here on the data in particular, what we see is quite a big difference with regards to the content excellence maturity of our medical colleagues relative to those in marketing and sales and commercial excellence types of positions. I think there's probably differing stories across different pharma companies that are on different points in their journey, but this is a fairly clear illustration of some of the silos that do exist across our business units. And in particular, this tells us more about the actual maturity within our medical function for working across the content lifecycle. And if our ambitions and our aims are to be customer centric and to deliver on personalization aims, we need to work to make sure that they have the same capabilities, competencies, and expectations, really, that our commercial excellence and our marketing colleagues have around delivering on customer centricity.
So that combination that we're talking about when it comes to how these organizational silos should be working together, why don't we think content transformation projects are resolving those issues?
Yeah, it's a fair question, Hannah. So, I work with a lot of different clients at the moment who are on different points in their content transformation journeys. And I get asked this quite a lot. Why is this not sticking? Why is this initiative maybe not working the way that I would hope it would? And what we've put together here is our perspective on some of those blocks or those barriers that are coming to life. And what you see here are some direct quotes from the research that we do around content enablement that help us to illustrate this point. So speaking directly to the data that we just looked at, I think one of the biggest challenges is around these organizational silos. And importantly, as we think about how we grow and we evolve in the content space, we look to build capability. And at the moment, we tend to build that capability within a given silo. So within our medical function or within our commercial function. And what's more is that in some instances, and in many instances, we establish transformation programs within those different silos. So I'm working with a few clients at the moment who are doing content transformation programs that are explicitly for commercial. And when we get out there and we actually talk to the affiliates, the first thing they ask is, well, what about medical? Because at the point of the affiliate, these things are being treated as the same thing more and more now. And so it really needs to be thought through from the very start that these need to be the same initiatives. The outcome of this is that transformation tends to be happening at different rates across our different silos. And it becomes that the actual capability that comes into play, as we saw on the last screen, is moving at different rates as well, which makes our aims around customer centricity much more difficult. What's more is that we seem to have a bit of an unclear mission when it comes to content transformation in particular. So most of our life science companies have a mission or a vision around omnichannel at the moment. And typically, content sits as a pillar within that space. And of course, this makes sense. It's part of the story. It's a piece of the puzzle. But as we have bigger ambitions around personalization and we need higher volumes of content that are created in fragments that can be put together in new ways, it means that the scope of the problem becomes much bigger, which means we need to treat it as such. And we need to get to a point where we have a really clear vision and mission around content transformation that we can then align folks within market, at regional and at global level to and tether them to. We also have what we lovingly call the shiny thing syndrome. And I think this is nothing new, really, within the life science industry, where we have new trends, we have exciting things like omnichannel, AI, MBA, etc. And we put things in place, whether they're technology or enablement programs, to answer some of that. But what we don't always do very well is focus on competencies and actual capability enablement. And so when it gets down to the point of someone locally or even in a regional or global team, in a lot of instances, they don't have the skills or the competencies to necessarily pick these things up and actually use them and run with them. And so we see a lot of times where folks then just rely on a third party. And they have a third party that's doing things like building their journeys, for example, and they're not thinking about how they actually are insourcing and building some of those competencies in the house, really. Lastly, but certainly not least, is I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges, is that it's no secret there's a lot of transformation that's happening right now within life sciences. And we have many programs that are amazing and aimed at the right things. But what happens is that as we run these programs, they eventually trickle down throughout our organization. And almost all of them land on the same person in many instances. And so we have these scenarios where you have one person who's surrounded and perhaps overwhelmed by the amount of change and the things that are coming down in front of them. And they don't know where to prioritize and they don't know where to focus. And if we take it back explicitly to content, the question becomes, well, where does this fit with regards to all the other things that are happening? Because this feels like it's part of the puzzle, but I'm not quite sure how this affects me. Is it somebody else that should do this, etc.? And so we get to this point where it effectively falls off a cliff a bit, and the teams that are in market don't pick this up. And the key point here is that these transformations, so a content transformation, it really doesn't happen in isolation.
I love the comment on this slide, one person, five changes. I think that's such an interesting way of thinking about this. And I know when we think about digital excellence maturity from a DT point of view, we think about all of those different capability areas that need to be able to sit across the organization to be able to truly deliver omni-channel experience. And to that point that you mentioned, content is just one part of that. And we definitely have seen through the last few years, improvements in the ways that organizations are coming towards these digital transformation efforts, especially from that front-facing channel perspective. On stage channels, we've seen a lot of improvements in those areas. But still, a lot of these internal channels are or backstage channels or kind of competency areas are really still struggling, really, when it comes to that maturity perspective. And I think that point that you mentioned, one person, five change, I think is a key part of that. Because at the moment, I think the amount of transformation that is going on with inside these organizations, that scale and breadth of transformation for these programs is creating a lot more work, to be honest, for one or two people within inside the organization. When it comes to regional teams, when it comes to in-market teams, these teams are being asked to do a lot more work. They're either having to be involved in the transformation efforts themselves, or if they're within inside the teams that are being impacted by this transformation, are going through a huge amount of change in the way that they're supposed to be working, setting up, and thinking about the way that they have to change their ways of working almost quite regularly. I think sometimes with the pace of change, especially with agile methodologies coming through, you're almost in a continuous change cycle now for some parts of the organizations in terms of how things are rapidly evolving and adapting. Do you think that is the case, Alicia?
Yeah, and I think there's a variety of different ways that we can try and tackle this stuff. And when we think about how we fix the model, so to speak, and that's maybe not the best term for this, it's that we need to take these challenges and kind of flip them on their heads. And if we know that there's all this transformation and these things happening, can we distill it down and bring it back to basics in terms of how we achieve some of these outcomes? Um, and the first thing that we really think needs to happen is real handshakes, and not just kind of fortnightly calls and conversations between our commercial and our medical colleagues. But we need to break the walls down properly. And we need to find a way to ensure that when we're building things, and I mean this from the point of operations, when we're building an operating model for how we're going to be customer centric and how we're going to produce customer centric content, we need to make sure that everybody is involved in that process, is using the same technologies, has the same skills, can leverage these things at the same rate, so that we're all actually moving towards the same endpoint. And it really is that until we get to the point where these silos are properly broken down, and not just at the point of an annual plan that's created, but day to day, we will struggle to be able to create content that is customer centric and meeting their preferences. The next part is how we actually put vision into action. We have these beautiful vision statements and these North Stars that we're moving towards across our organizations. And these go out into the world, and different strategies get picked up in different ways. But what we need to start doing is really tethering ourselves to those visions. And if there is a vision that we are working towards, if it is personalization and that is what we want to achieve, then every piece of capability that we build in our organization needs to be a stepping stone in how we climb that mountain and get closer to that endpoint. And if we start building something, whether it's skills, whether it's a tool or otherwise, that doesn't actually help us move up, instead it's just another thing that's helping us move outwards, then we bin it. We don't do it because it's not helping us to achieve the outcome that we're actually working towards. And then it becomes instead another thing in that noise, in that one person, five changes types of effects we're seeing. The next point is to ditch the buzzwords. And I'm conscious that we work in consulting and we're very good at buzzwords, and there's probably a few buzzwords on this slide even. But there's a piece that I'm seeing at the moment around all the talk around personalization, omni-channel, and at a certain stage, they do start to feel like buzzwords. And it comes back to, well, what are we actually trying to achieve? And let's just simplify this. And I've had multiple clients in the last month say to me, I don't want to hear the word omnichannel. Get rid of it. I'm done with it. And the reality is that we've put a word against something when really what we're talking about is customer engagement and customer excellence, right? And how do we actually engage our customers in a way that makes sense for them? That's it, layman's terms. And so let's focus on that experience piece and what we're actually trying to deliver, and work backwards to the content that we need to put in place, and less focus on the next buzzword or the next thing that perhaps we're talking about in the industry. And then last but certainly not least is, can we break the mold a bit and start thinking more holistically with our roadmaps and how we're putting these things into place? I mentioned earlier that most of us have missions and strategies around omnichannel at the moment. We're building towards these things, but in some instances, and in most instances, these things are being built in those silos. And we need to start thinking about how we innovate here, how we disrupt, and really how we answer what I think our customers, and whether that's an HCP or a patient or a payer or a policymaker, et cetera, what they're asking for, which is the same thing they ask for in other facets of their life, which is a simple experience that feels seamless and doesn't feel like it's four different experiences, because our medical colleagues perhaps are a bit too far from our commercial colleagues and aren't talking to each other the way that we know that they should be. So I want to challenge everybody to break the mold, and let's try to be more innovative around how we're actually driving some of this forward.
I love all four of these recommendations you've got. Although personally, as a consultant, I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to be able to live without the buzzwords. Which one would you say is kind of, if you could just focus on one thing, what is, or if you want to start somewhere, which one out of these fours would you say is the one to move on first?
So I actually think the easiest one is to only build capability tethered to your vision. So that is a set of business rules. That is making sure that you have accountability to what you're actually building and doing. The one that I think has the most impact, however, is the first, around real handshakes. And if we think back to the data that we've shown, whether it be the preferences data that you've shown, Hannah, around the fact that a lot of the preferences around content types are medical information, things that maybe sit in clinical spaces. And then if we look at the maturity model and the differences between our medical colleagues and some of our more commercial colleagues, until we get these guys coming together in a more real way, we will struggle here. And so this is a big change, and this is thinking about our organizations fundamentally and how they're structured. And it's not something that's going to happen in 6 months, but this is the one that I think will be the most impactful over time.
And firstly, from my perspective, I think it is, like you say, that customer piece that can really hopefully drive to get those people in a room together at the same time to start making those handshakes. And if we say we want to be a customer centric organization, that's got to be the mandate, hopefully, that can get these people together around a table to have those conversations.
Absolutely. Although we do get in trouble when we say the word mandate sometimes across our life science clients. But I mean, that just speaks, though, to the amount of transformation that we know is ongoing at the moment, right? And so I do want to acknowledge that we're seeing a lot of great progress. And I mentioned at the very start that there are many different programs that are popping up that are trying to approach this in different ways. And I am feeling a bit of an outreached hand at the moment from the industry saying, can we talk about this, and can you give us new ideas for how we do some of this stuff, because we want to be better and we want to achieve more. And so it's been nice to see the openness around this topic, to transform and to change. And to be frank, I'm fairly excited to see what happens next, and where some of these guys go, in order to achieve these aims around personalization.
Potentially in a post omnichannel world.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.